I was born in 1961, and my family moved to Elderon Avenue, right off of Northern Parkway, when I was about 3. So I was growing up here in the late 60s and early 70s, and we lived in the same house, and I lived there until I went away to college in 1979. Our neighborhood was all black families, and the white people that I knew growing up there were my teachers at Grove Park Elementary School. So I later realized that they were there. They had taught at those schools for a long time. So my kindergarten teacher was Mrs. Umstein, all these sort of German or Jewish names, Miss Schwartzfeger, Mrs. Quam. But all the kids in my class were black. I think we had 1 or 2 white students in the class. And by the time I graduated, most of the teachers were black and the principal was black. The other place I saw a white person in my neighborhood was my piano teacher, who lived a couple blocks over. His name was Louis Shub. He was a very serious piano teacher, but I realized these were families that had lived in the neighborhood before the arrival of black families. And so they were all kind of elders. And sort of slowly over time, they disappeared. I think what made it special was that I think I thought that we lived in the suburbs for a long time. So my grandmother lived downtown off of North Avenue on Pulaski Street, and my aunt lived on Payson Street. So when we visited the rest of my dad's family here in Baltimore, we'd go to the city. They lived in row houses. And when my parents married, they were married before they married each other. So it was a second marriage, and they each had a son. My dad bought my mom a house on Akintarali Terrace across from Druid Hill Park. And I think what my mom said was it wasn't a house because it was attached to other houses. So they then moved to Elderon. So when I visited the other family, I thought we were living fat. You know, I had a big yard. We had fruit trees. We had apple and pear trees. We had strawberries for a while. I could hang out with kids in their yards, and, it just seemed like we had a lot of freedom. And it wasn't really until I went to Roland Park Country School in the Roland Park neighborhood when I was in 7th grade that I realized, there are really well-off people in this town, and we are not those people. So we moved here in 1963, and I went to Grove Park Elementary School. And then when my mother taught in the Baltimore City Public Schools, but when I got to 7th grade, instead of going on to Pimlico with my classmates, she sent me to Roland Park Country School, which is a all-girls school it's now over 100 years old, in the Roland Park neighborhood. And I was probably the 6th or 7th African-American student to go to that school. I entered in 1974, and I was one of 2 black girls out of about 35, and the other one promptly left. So the next 6 years, I was the only black girl. I was the only black girl in my class who graduated in 1979 from Roland Park. And my experience there was interesting because there was probably an influx of African-American students to the Baltimore City private schools in that northern Baltimore, that Roland Park and Guilford neighborhood. So there was a bus company called Harrelson Transportation, based on Liberty Road in the county. But Mr. Harrelson picked up all of us African-American kids in a van. We were picked up at home, and he circled around sort of Northwest Baltimore, over by Hilton, and dropped us off at Roland Park, at Gilman, at Bryn Mawr. And I remember, because I had to get up at 5:30, this bus picked me up at 6 in the morning, because he had to hit all these houses and hit all these schools in time for me to get there when school started at 8:15 or 8:20 or whatever. So it was the first time I really had a sense of we were the other. We were being bussed in, we were all together. And the people that were in my class really came from much more privileged backgrounds. I remember the girls talked about going to dancing school. And for me, dancing school was ballet class, but they were actually going to some kind of school where they learned to dance with boys, like the foxtrot and, like ballroom dancing. So that was my school experience, and while I will say I got an outstanding education at Roland Park, and I am grateful to it, when I got there, the first thing that I was aware of was how behind I was compared to the girls who had grown up in that school. So when I entered, I remember the first year I had a D- in math. I had really basically missed a year. Like whatever I ended at Grove Park, they were like a year ahead of me. And I had always been a top student. I was a reader. My mother was a teacher. She was a librarian. So, school came easy to me before. And she went and met with my teacher at Roland Park. And the teacher said, well, maybe she needs to be in a different math class. But I got there, and the school was very challenging. And it was the first time I was aware that my education at Grove Park was, less in some way. So my mother went to meet with the teacher after the first report cards came. And the thing I really remember most about Roland Park, and I give them credit for, is that the math teacher said to my mother, she belongs in this. I was in the top math class. She says, she belongs in this class. She can do the work. There were lots of things about Roland Park where I did not belong, but her saying that I did belong in that moment educationally, I think, is one of the most powerful things that a teacher can do. So I stayed at Roland Park. I graduated in 1979. I went on to Duke University, but it was a much different trajectory than most of my friends in the Elderon neighborhood that, in West Arlington where I lived. The top students there went on to Western, and they went to Towson. They went to great colleges, but I had a very different experience. I think what made our neighborhood so special was really, it was like a suburban experience. We played with the neighborhood kids, and even as I got to be a teenager, I hung out with the kids on the street. In the summer, we hung out under the streetlights. We rode bikes around and went to each other's each other's houses. It was very different, very different feel from the way my cousins who grew up in the city in a row house, were in city streets. I actually thought we lived in the suburbs for most of my childhood until I went to Roland Park, and then I realized, oh no, this is not the suburbs. The downside of that was you were kind of disconnected from the city. So I remember there was one bus, the 44, that went on Rogers Avenue, and I feel like it only ran once a day. Like it wasn't a bus you could take anywhere. And on an exciting day for me as a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old was my mother would drive to the Mondawmin Mall, which is, I think, the first sort of shopping mall in the country. And we'd catch the bus there and go downtown to shop at Hutzler's. And we would stop and get candy corn. There was a store that was only candy corn. But to me, that was going to the city. So it was fun, it was different, but it sort of emphasized how far away we felt from the city. So I would say that my neighborhood growing up was not very diverse, with the exception of the handful of teachers or my piano teacher who were white families from the before time. And when I look back, now on Facebook, there are groups from my elementary school. I realized that 10 years before I came, all the kids were white. So when I went to Roland Park, then it flipped. I was the only black person in my class. But interestingly, the person who became my dearest and closest friend, starting when I arrived there in 1974, was a girl from this neighborhood. She was Jewish. Her father ran Goldstein Style Shop in Old Town, and she lived on Pinckney Road. Her name was Lynn Goldstein. And I think she and I bonded because we were from Northwest Baltimore. We were not from Roland Park, even though We were from very different parts of Northwest Baltimore. But she came to my house, she hung out at my house, I hung out at her house. It was, with her, I could actually be myself. So despite the fact that she was Jewish and I was black, her family, they became like second family to me. My family became second family to her. And I will say, I'm gonna be 60 this year, and I still talk to that woman almost every day using an app where we send video messages. There were certainly big gaps of time where we weren't in touch, but I think it shows you how bonded we were by this neighborhood and by the experience of being together out of this neighborhood, that we've remained, really, she's my dearest friend for so long.